So first off, I'm really excited to be talking to you today because I'm a fan of the music, but also because I thought the documentary was really deep and interesting and one of the most fascinating things I've seen in a long time. So I wanted to, kind of delve into your existential portfolio. So let's start at the very beginning. I don't think a lot of people knew that your dad died when you were a child. How did that experience shape who you are as a person and your music?
Well, it's such a good question. And the truth is, considering it's such a defining part of my life, of my childhood, and this might sound odd, I've never really thought about it that much. And the reason being is it happened when I was, I think, between 2 and 3 years old. And I don't remember it. And for some reason, which I still don't understand, my mother and I never talked about it.
Wow.
So when I was growing up, and I just thought that was normal. Oh, if I have a dead parent, we will never speak of it. And it was only in adulthood that I realized how strange it was to never talk about your dead parent. I really didn't know anything about him except for a few old photos. And the one thing I will say that I'm in an odd way grateful for is it's hard to miss something that you never knew.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, I don't have memories of having a father. So I just always sort of self-identified, understandably, empirically, as someone who doesn't have a father. And what I will say is it was one of the many facets of my identity that made me feel separate from the world around me.
Yeah. And then you talk about moving to Darien, Connecticut, and how you felt a sense of isolation there, but you sort of found a calling in music. And you said that it took the confusion and made it beautiful. Talk about what finding music meant to you.
Well, and I sort of addressed this in the documentary that at a very early age, to oversimplify it, I think my brain started assessing things in the world on the criteria of, do they feel safe? And at an early age, I sort of almost compartmentalized and said, okay, music makes me feel safe. Animals make me feel safe. Books, nature, these things make me feel safe. So that's in the safe side. The other side was humans, because humans simply did not make me feel safe. I felt very little comfort in the world of humans. Not surprisingly, I'm currently 55 years old and I live alone and I largely work alone and I spend my time with music, animals, books, and going outside. So really, in some ways I could say that even though I'm old, I haven't really, in my basic orientation to things, changed all that much.
Yeah. Do you think you recall one of these incidents where you took some acid and you had a panic attack for almost 3 months? Do you think that was the start of that feeling, or was it something predating that?
I think that I started experiencing anxiety, and just general sort of dislocated discomfort at a very early age, possibly even in the womb. And it kept building, but I didn't have the means to process it. I didn't have the language or the skills to process this anxiety. And then when I was 19, I tried acid for the first time, and I feel like it broke the wall between me and this anxiety. And the anxiety flooded, figuratively speaking, or maybe even neurochemically speaking, the rest of my brain. And yeah, it triggered, as you mentioned, it was an anxiety attack that lasted in a plateaued form for actually about 6 months.
Wow.
And so that was, as far as a dark night of the soul, that was pretty dark.
Yeah. You moved into a factory in Connecticut and started to DJ. You say in the documentary that this was one of the happiest periods of your life. Why was that so?
Well, I mean, I was at that point maybe like 21 years old, and on the surface of things, everything was terrible. I was a college dropout. I was really broke. I mean, I was making between $2,000 and $3,000 a year. I was DJing a few nights a week at a dive bar, and I remember it was a big deal. I got a raise from $25 a night to $40 a night. And I was living in an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood. I had no running water and I had no bathroom. It was, on the surface of things, pretty grim, but I was so happy because I was working in music.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, if you were to talk to, I think most, let's call like public figure musicians, writers, actors, whatever, the period that we long to escape, in hindsight, is usually the period that we're most fond of.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you talk to Keith Richards, like the period that he probably loved the most was before the Rolling Stones made their first album.
Yeah.
It's that, but it's also the period that when you're going through it, you're like, oh, I can't wait for this to end. And then a few decades pass, and you're like, actually, like I had really good friends. I had this wonderful driving sense of purpose. I didn't care at all about my material circumstances. I mean, I was living in an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood, but there was just a comfort that came with it, because there was that. Another thing that happens, I think, as we get older is when you're 20 years old, when you're 21 years old, you and everyone you know are socioeconomically in the exact same place.
Yeah.
Within a little bit of reason, but like everyone's, no one has families yet. No one has either bottomed out or made a ton of money. No one has moved across country yet. Like you still live in this like tight-knit community. And then when that fractures over time, there's a sort of a loss that you become aware of, that those formative years were actually probably a lot better than you're aware of when you were going through them.
Yeah. Now, then you talk about in the documentary about this sort of happenstance where you release an album and it gets nothing, and then you do this remix of Go with the Twin Peaks theme remix into it, and then suddenly it explodes. Talk about where you got that idea, and two, what the feeling was when something, you were just kind of doing the same thing you'd always been doing, but one thing was hugely successful and the other wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I had never expected to have a career as a musician. I had never even expected to make music that anyone listened to. When I was in high school, I played in a punk rock band and we would play to 5 people a night. When I started DJing, I was sometimes playing to 3 people a night. Like my expectations were very small. So in 1990, I put out my first single called Go, and it was this minimal techno track, and it sold just shy of 1,000 copies. And I was amazed. I was like, wow, I'm with a record label. Even though I was also the assistant at the record label, like I cleaned the kitchen and sent faxes and took records to UPS. Like I was the unpaid labor at the record label, but still I'd sold almost 1,000 copies. And then this British record label wanted to release this song, but they said they could only release it with a remix. And I started working on a remix, and it was right when Twin Peaks started, and I love David Lynch. And so I think it might have even been as literal as work on a remix, watch Twin Peaks, go back to working on the remix, trying to work Laura Palmer's theme from Twin Peaks into the remix. And then this remix ended up being a top 10 record throughout Europe. So I was living in this abandoned factory, but flying back and forth to the UK and to Germany and to Benelux and Scandinavia to do all these like super high profile TV shows, still only making $3,000 a year.
But you said, yet with all this success, it felt really lonely to you. You started getting into drugs and drinking. Why wasn't the success enough for you? What was it that wasn't filling up?
Well, what I think I've learned, what I hope I've learned is really the problem that so many of us, one of the main problems so many of us face is expecting things to perform a function for which they're not designed. You know, like if I give you a hammer, that hammer is great for hammering in a nail, less so if you want to, I don't know, make banana bread. You know, if you try to use a hammer to make banana bread, you're going to end up really frustrated. So fame, even material success, financial success, all these things, they're fine. The problem that I had is I expected them to fix my psychological issues. I expected them to fix my existential issues. And clearly, that's not what fame and success are supposed to do. And all it takes is like a cursory look at the number of famous people who've made similar or have had similar expectations and been profoundly confused and disappointed by fame's inability to fix them. You know, that's why at the beginning of the documentary, we flashed to Ernest Hemingway, Kurt Cobain, Anthony Bourdain, Avicii, etc. All these people who were probably, because there's this confusion that arises that's really terrifying when you spend your whole life thinking that when you finally get to that place of accomplishment, you'll be happy. And then you get to that place of accomplishment and you're not happy. In fact, you're isolated and lonely and scared. You don't know what else to do. You know, it's not like there's a plan B. It's like, because most of us are like, oh, well, I'll never be famous. I'll never be successful. And then you get there and you're sort of like, you haven't planned for anything else. So then you start drinking more, you start doing more drugs. And some people tragically end their lives because they just don't, you know, they don't know how to fix their lives.
Yeah. I have to wrap up, but I want to ask you just one more question because I want to hear about how you found the meaning through leaving the drugs behind, and veganism really provided that thing that you were missing really in your life. It's sort of a calling higher than yourself. Talk to me a little bit about what veganism means to you and how that's helped you in your sobriety.
Well, before I got sober, which was about 12 years ago, I was as scared and selfish and narcissistic as a person can be. You know, like I went out into the world and I was not thinking, what can I add to the world? How can I be of service? How can I help people? It was just this selfish focus on myself. And then I got sober and realized pretty quickly, like the goal of sobriety is not sobriety, it's to live a healthy spiritual life. And a healthy spiritual life, I would say by definition, involves being willing to be of service, you know, being willing to put others' needs ahead of your own. And for me, a huge part of that is animal rights. You know, like that's the purpose that is so much bigger than me, that's so much more important than my own life, you know, the thing I'm willing to die for. And there's basically a settling comfort that comes with knowing that like no matter what I go through, it's less important than my commitment to animal rights. Because my idea, and you could even, if we wanted to have a long esoteric conversation, I do have this sort of belief that humans are weirdly excluded from the natural order of things. Like you could, I don't know what you want to call it, divinity, grace, a state of pure being, but somehow humans are separated from that. And I don't know what it is. We punish those beings who exist in a state of grace, animals, nature. And to me, there's almost like no more noble calling than protecting the innocent. You know, and for me, that's the trillion animals who are killed by and for humans every year. And one of the most heartbreaking things, if you've ever been around animals who've been brutalized on factory farms, animals who are about to be slaughtered, the most heartbreaking thing is the look in their eyes is confusion. You know, it's fear, but it's confused because they don't understand why they've been brutalized. There's violence in the animal kingdom, but there's not systemic brutality. And so I feel like working to somehow change that is just so much more important than my career, than my happiness, my health. It's even more important than my own life.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. I really thought the documentary was really excellent, and really pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. I'm glad we got a chance to talk.